Hello, my name is Kent Field, and thank you for tuning into this YouTube channel, The Bible versus Opinions. God bless you in your search for the truth. While all people have opinions on many subjects, including the Bible and religion, not all opinions carry the same weight or value. For example, would you go to a plumber for his advice on brain surgery? Would you go to a mechanic for his advice on heart surgery? The point is, not all opinions carry the same weight or value on a particular subject. That's why I'm not offering you my mere opinion, but Bible answers alone. So here's the challenge. Are you open to learning beyond your current understanding and knowledge of the Bible? If so, then this channel is for you. If these studies have helped you to grow in your understanding of the Bible, or even life itself, please like and subscribe and share this channel with others so that they too may be challenged and grow in their understanding of the scriptures.
So, what if I told you that the museum placard you read about Julius Caesar, the really detailed account of his military conquests in Gaul, what if I told you that is largely based on a document written 1,000 years after he was assassinated?
Right, which is, it's a massive gap. It completely upends the way we view the ancient world.
Yeah, exactly. Because today we're basically tearing down this illusion of historical permanence. We're going to look at the actual physical mechanics of how ancient history survived. And the reality is far more precarious than most of us realize.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
We tend to think of classical history as this, continuous, unbroken chain of evidence from the moment it happened right to our modern textbooks.
Right, like a direct line.
Exactly. But when you look at the raw data of historical preservation, that chain is actually missing quite a few links.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are exploring a really fascinating, purely historical angle. It's presented in a series of lessons by author Kent Field, and it's titled A Reason for Believing.
And so, to be clear right from the jump, Field's overarching work here is a theological argument, right? He is building a case for the Christian faith.
Yes, exactly. But our mission today is to step back from the theology entirely. We're focusing strictly on the author's data-driven analysis of ancient historiography. We were looking at what he calls the acid test of history.
Which means we are exclusively evaluating the mechanics of preservation. We're examining how historians use specific metrics to determine if an ancient document is, a reliable representation of what was originally written.
Right.
And then we're going to compare the undisputed classics of Greek and Roman history against the documents of the New Testament.
And I have to say, the numbers the author presents here are just staggering. But to understand the friction here, we really have to start with the foundational problem of all ancient history.
The big dilemma.
Right. Which is this. There are absolutely zero original manuscripts for any major historical record from antiquity, none. The actual parchment or papyrus that Julius Caesar or Plato or, the Apostle Paul touched with their pens, it's gone.
Yeah, it has all turned to dust. Long gone.
So, okay, let's unpack this for a second. If nobody has the originals, isn't all of ancient history just a massive multi-century game of telephone? How do we know the message didn't get totally scrambled?
That is the exact right question to ask. And it's the baseline reality for any classicist or ancient historian. Every translation we read, every account you study in school is based entirely on copies of copies.
Copies of copies.
Exactly. And the moment you introduce manual copying,
right,
by fallible human scribes working over centuries, you naturally introduce the potential for error or embellishment or just lost information.
So how does a modern historian look at a copy of a document and have, any confidence that it accurately reflects an original they have literally never seen?
Well, they rely on a highly specific analytical toolkit. And it's primarily focused on two vital metrics. First, the copy count, and second, the time gap.
Copy count and time gap. Okay.
And the significance of these two data points, I really can't overstate it, they form the absolute bedrock of textual criticism.
Okay, so let's break those down for the listener. The copy count seems fairly straightforward. It's just the total number of surviving manuscript copies we have today, right?
Yeah. Simply put, how many copies survive the ravages of time?
I imagine that acts as a sort of ancient decentralized version control.
Yeah.
Because if you only have one copy of a document, you have zero way to know if the scribe who wrote it was having a bad day and just skipped a whole paragraph.
Exactly. A high copy count provides an error correction mechanism. It lets you cross-reference. Because you have to remember, the transmission of ancient texts wasn't a single linear chain. It was a branching tree.
Okay, what do you mean by a branching tree?
So copies were sent to different geographic regions. Say, an early copy goes to Alexandria, One goes to Rome, one to Antioch. And from those regional nodes, more copies were made independently of each other.
Ah, I see. So if a scribe in Alexandria accidentally skips a line, maybe his eye jumped to a similar word on the next page, which happens, that mistake gets baked into his specific branch of copies.
Precisely. But, and this is the key, the scribes over in Rome and Antioch didn't make that exact same mistake.
Right. They'd make their own completely different mistakes, if any.
Exactly. So when modern scholars gather all those surviving manuscripts and lay them side by side, that singular Alexandrian error sticks out like a sore thumb.
Oh, wow. So the overwhelming agreement of the other geographic branches allows historians to just easily identify the mistake.
You got it. And that lets them reconstruct the original text with incredible accuracy. So naturally, the larger the copy count, the denser the network of cross-reference, and the higher your certainty of the text.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, so the second metric the author details is the time gap. So this is the span of time between when the original author supposedly penned the document and the date of the earliest surviving physical copy we actually have in our hands.
Right. And the time gap is crucial because it dictates the window of opportunity for legendary development.
Like myths creeping in.
Exactly. If an event happens and the very first recorded copy we have doesn't appear for, say, 800 years, that leaves 8 centuries for oral traditions to mutate.
Right, or for political agendas to alter the narrative.
Exactly, or for outright myths to be woven into the fabric of the story. 800 years is a massive amount of time for a story to change.
But if the gap is remarkably short, let's say only a few generations, there just isn't enough time for a widespread myth to completely displace the historical reality.
Right, especially because people who lived through the events or who knew the eyewitnesses might still be alive to challenge those fabricated accounts.
They just say, no, that's not how it happened.
Precisely. So that is the theoretical ideal. A high copy count and a very short time gap provide maximum historical confidence. But what Kent Field points out in his material is that when we look at the actual data for classical history, that ideal is almost never met.
Yeah, and this is where the numbers completely change my perspective on what we consider, proven history. The author sets a baseline by applying these two metrics to the absolute heavyweights of antiquity.
Let's look at the famous Greek historians Thucydides and Herodotus.
Right. They are universally recognized as the fathers of history, like undisputed.
Absolutely. Their works are foundational to our entire understanding of the Greco-Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian War, and they wrote those accounts between 480 and 400 BC.
Okay, 400 BC. But the earliest physical manuscript copies we actually possess of their work, they date to around 900 AD.
Which is just...
That is a time gap of 1,300 to 1,400 years. And the copy count. The total number of surviving manuscripts, so all we know of that era from them, is just 8.
Just 8 handwritten copies produced a millennium and a half after the fact. It's wild when you think about it.
It is. And then Field looks at Julius Caesar. His Gallic War is like our primary source for Rome's conquest of Gaul, written by the commander himself around 58 to 50 BC.
And let me guess the time gap.
The earliest copy we have is from 950 AD, another massive 1,000-year time gap. And the total number of copies in existence, only 9 or 10.
Wow. And this pattern, it really holds across the board. Look at Livy's massive history of Rome. He wrote it around the turn of the 1st century. We have a fragment, just a fragment dating to 325 AD.
Okay, so a shorty gap of about 300 years, but it's only a fragment.
Right. In total, only 22 manuscript copies of his work survive.
The most shocking one to me was Tacitus. His histories and annals are crucial bedrock sources for 1st century Rome. Written around 100 AD, the earliest copies date to 950 AD and 1100 AD.
So that's an 850 to 1,000-year gap.
Exactly. And the total copies, only 2. 2 manuscripts survive to tell us all we know of these documents. We are basing vast swaths of Roman history on just 2 copies made 1,000 years after the events.
And Field presents this data to highlight a really foundational academic reality. No serious classical scholar casts doubt on the authenticity of Herodotus or Caesar or Tacitus based on these metrics.
Right, no one is saying Caesar didn't fight in Gaul.
Exactly. Despite relying on single-digit copy counts and millennium-long time gaps, the academic consensus is that these documents are reliable representations of the originals. This is just the accepted working standard for ancient historiography.
It is the cost of doing business in ancient history. I mean, you work with what survived.
You'd have to.
But having established that baseline of what constitutes, good historical evidence, the source of material pivots, we now look to see how the New Testament documents stack up against this exact same classical standard.
And the contrast isn't just a matter of degrees, right? It's a completely different statistical universe. The divergence in the raw data is what Field builds his entire argument around. If we rigorously apply the exact same textual criticism, toolkit copy counts, and time gaps, the New Testament emerges as this extreme historical anomaly.
So let's look at the copy count first. Instead of relying on, say, 2 copies of Tacitus or 10 copies of Caesar, the author notes that the New Testament has over 4,000 surviving Greek manuscript copies.
Over 4,000.
Yeah. And the source clarifies that if you expand that to include fragments and early partial texts, that number balloons to between 10,000 and 20,000.
Which is just staggering. The sheer volume of material means that the decentralized cross-referencing network we discussed earlier, it is incredibly dense.
Because historians aren't just trying to reconcile 2 different copies.
Right. They're comparing thousands of independent nodes across the ancient Mediterranean, and that allows them to trace scribal errors back to their source with almost forensic precision.
And then there's the time gap. With classical histories, we are accustomed to seeing a 1,000-year dark age between the original writing and the first surviving copy.
Right, the standard gap.
But for the New Testament, the earliest major copies date back to the 3rd and 4th centuries.
Leaving a gap of roughly 250 to 350 years between the events of the 1st century and the massive compilations we have today. And Field specifically highlights several of these early codices in the text.
Right, he mentions the Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Alexandrinus, Codex Vaticanus, Codex Ephraemi, and Codex Bizai.
And the author also brings up a really fascinating linguistic detail regarding these specific codices. It actually functions as a sort of chronological watermark.
Oh, yeah. He notes they were written in a style called Greek caps or uncials.
Right, uncial script. A highly distinct literary hand. It consists entirely of capital letters with absolutely no spaces or punctuation between the words.
None at all.
None. It's a format known as scriptio continua.
Which sounds like an absolute nightmare for the person tasked with copying it, let alone reading it. Why on earth would they write like that?
Well, it was largely a matter of economics. Papyrus and parchment were highly expensive commodities in the ancient world.
Oh, so they're trying to save space.
Exactly. Scribes couldn't afford to waste premium writing surface on empty spaces or margins, so they just packed the letters together continuously. It required immense skill to read and copy accurately.
I can imagine. But the crucial point Field makes about this uncial script is that it eventually became completely obsolete. Around 900 AD, it passed completely out of use.
Right. It was replaced by a more fluid, lowercase cursive style that was much faster to write.
Which is incredibly significant for dating these manuscripts, right?
Oh, hugely significant. Because the uncial style died out before the turn of the millennium, its presence on these major New Testament codices permanently anchors them in late antiquity.
It's hard proof.
Yes, it provides hard, physical evidence that these thousands of copies were produced centuries before the scribes of the Middle Ages ever even sat down to copy out our earliest surviving manuscripts of Caesar or Herodotus.
So we have established the mechanics. We see the massive discrepancy in the data. Now, we arrive at the core of Kent Field's premise. Why does he spend so much time building this statistical fortress?
It's all leading up to a philosophical challenge, the thing he calls the acid test.
Right. So what is that exactly?
Field proposes that this data forces a crisis of consistency for the modern reader. His thesis is this: if an individual willingly accepts the writings of Caesar, Livy, and Tacitus as accurate history,
Comfortably working past their 1,000-year time gaps and their single-digit copy counts.
Exactly. If they accept those, but that same individual rejects the New Testament documents as historically unreliable, they are no longer operating on the principles of historical science.
He argues it is a demonstration of pure bias. You are applying an impossible standard to one set of ancient documents while giving a free pass to another simply because of the content they contain.
Right. By the accepted rules of ancient historiography, the New Testament possesses an exponentially higher degree of manuscript attestation than literally any other classical history.
So Field asserts that rejecting its physical reliability requires a person to effectively abandon the rules of history altogether.
That's his acid test. And to bolster this argument, the author doesn't just look inward at the Greek manuscripts. He brings in external corroboration to show that this robust text is also anchored in observable reality.
Yeah, the source points to prominent secular and atheistic historians, specifically naming H.G. Wells, Will Durant, and Arnold Toynbee.
And these are towering figures in the study of world civilization. When Will Durant wrote his massive multi-volume Story of Civilization, or when H.G. Wells compiled the Outline of History, they had to address the first century.
Right, you can't just skip it.
Exactly. And Field points out that these secular historians inevitably relied on the New Testament as their primary, sober historical source for the life of Jesus and the conditions of first-century Judea.
Even though they personally rejected the supernatural claims within the text, they recognized that the document itself, its geography, its political frameworks, its cultural details, was highly accurate.
They trusted the historical skeleton of the text because the manuscript evidence demanded it.
Field also pairs this with the unwitting confirmation provided by ancient pagan writers, right? Specifically Cornelius Tacitus and Pliny the Younger.
Yes, and these men were Roman officials. They were actively hostile to the early Christian movement. Yet when Tacitus writes his Annals, he independently confirms that a man named Christus suffered the extreme penalty under the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of the procurators, Pontius Pilate.
And then there's Pliny the Younger, writing to the Emperor Trajan. He independently describes the practices and the rapid spread of this group in the early 2nd century. Field is highlighting that the enemies of the movement were actively confirming its historical footprint.
Exactly. The author is synthesizing all of these elements into a single, immovable premise. The New Testament cannot be categorized as a fairy tale or a mythological epic. The sheer volume of perfectly preserved copies, the short time gap, the reliance of secular historians, and the corroboration of hostile Roman officials, all of it converges to classify the text as a verified historical document detailing real times, real places, and real people.
Okay, but this is where I have to step in and apply some pressure to the author's logic, just looking at it objectively. Let's say I accept the data. Let's say the copy count is pristine, the text hasn't been altered, and the geography is perfect.
Okay.
Just because a document is perfectly preserved and gets the name of the Roman governor right, does that automatically mean the extraordinary claims inside the document are true?
That's the leap.
I mean, I could have 10,000 perfectly preserved copies of a comic book set in a real city like New York, but that doesn't make Spider-Man a historical figure. How does Field bridge the gap between a historically reliable text and a historically factual resurrection?
That is the ultimate pivot of Field's acid test, and it requires carefully following his logic here. You are absolutely correct that textual criticism only proves we possess what the original authors actually wrote. It doesn't inherently prove the author was telling the truth.
Right, it just proves they wrote it down.
But here is the author's leap. Field argues that because the text is established as a sober historical account and not a legend that evolved over a 1,000-year dark age, the reader is stripped of their easiest defense mechanism.
Which is?
When faced with the New Testament, a modern skeptic usually relies on the Christ myth theory. It's the idea that a simple teacher would slowly turn into a divine figure through centuries of mythological exaggeration and scribal tampering.
Ah, the game of telephone defense. The idea that the story just got wildly out of hand over hundreds of years.
Exactly. But Field argues that the data, the 4,000 copies, and the relatively short 250-year time gap completely annihilates that theory. There simply wasn't enough time, nor was there the scribal isolation required for a massive mythological overhaul of the text to occur without leaving a massive paper trail of conflicting copies.
Because if a scribe in the 2nd century decided to just invent a miracle out of thin air, the other branches of the decentralized network wouldn't have it, and we would see the discrepancy today.
Yes. You'd see it glaringly. Therefore, Field argues, you are forced to conclude that the extraordinary claims, specifically the resurrection, were not later additions. They were the original foundational claims being made by the eyewitnesses in the 1st century.
I see. So the author is essentially trapping the reader. He is saying, I have proven through standard historical metrics that this document has not been tampered with. This is exactly what the eyewitnesses claimed. And because you can no longer blame centuries of legendary development, you have to look those ancient authors in the eye and make a binary choice. Either these specific men were intentionally lying to the world, or they were telling the truth.
That is the crux of A Reason for Believing. He uses the dry, objective science of manuscript counting to force a profoundly uncomfortable historical reckoning. By removing the comfortable buffer of legend, he demands that the reader confront the text on its own terms.
It really is a brilliant structural argument when you lay it out like that. We started by looking under the hood of ancient history, realizing that, well, everything we know about antiquity is hanging by the thread of a few late copies.
And we unpacked how historians actually do their jobs, using copy counts to cross-reference errors across geographic networks, and using time gaps to gauge the likelihood of legendary accretion.
We saw how the undisputed classics of Caesar and Tacitus function perfectly well on single-digit manuscripts and thousand-year gaps. And then we saw how the New Testament completely shatters that baseline, with thousands of unscripted codices appearing centuries earlier.
Which sets up Field's ultimate challenge. If you trust the threadbare evidence for the Roman Empire, but reject the mountain of evidence for the New Testament, you have to ask yourself, what is truly driving your historical standards?
It really leaves us with a highly provocative thought for anyone engaged in learning. You know, the criteria we use to validate our knowledge of the past is often largely unexamined.
Very true.
So, the next time you are reading a history book or watching a documentary about the ancient world, pause and ask yourself a simple question. How many copies of the story actually survived, and how many centuries passed before someone finally wrote it down?
It's a great question to keep in your back pocket.
Because once you understand the significance of text gaps and copy counts, you realize that the foundation of history isn't solid marble. It's a mosaic of copied fragments. And understanding how those fragments were preserved might entirely change your standard for what you consider to be proven truth. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the mechanics of history. It's been an incredible journey through the ancient archives, and we will catch you on the next one.
Thanks for being a part of that study segment. I promise you that, Lord willing, there's more to come. With the understanding that the mind can only absorb what the seat can endure, many of these studies have been broken up into a series of bite-sized segments. So be sure to look for the next segment in each Bible study subject, so you won't miss out on any important information. Please like and subscribe if you feel that this lesson's helped you, and God bless you in your search for truth.